Welcome to On Becoming an Anti-Racist Institution, Implications for College and University Educators, featuring Dr. Frank Harris. On behalf of the Office of Institutional Diversity and our co-sponsors, Black Lives at MUD, Chicano Latino Student Affairs, ASHMIC Diversity, and the Office of Black Student Affairs, we are excited to have you join us this evening. Please note, this will be a Zoom webinar style event. This event will be recorded, and should you have any questions, please feel free to write them in the question and answer box. It is my pleasure now to introduce Assistant Dean of the Office of Institutional Diversity, Dean Ariana Figueroa.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Dean Jenny. I have the opportunity to introduce you to our presenter this evening. Dr. Frank Harris III is a professor of post-secondary education and co-director of the Community College Equity Assessment Lab at San Diego State University. He is best known for his expertise in racial inequity in post-secondary education and has made important contributions to knowledge about college student development and the social construction of gender and race in the college context. His work prioritizes populations that have been historically underrepresented and underserved in education. Before joining the faculty at San Diego State, Dr. Harris worked as a student affairs educator and college administrator in the areas of student affairs administration, student crisis support and advocacy, new student orientation programs, multicultural student affairs, academic advising, and enrollment services. He also served as an adjunct professor of speech communication at Los Angeles Trade Technical College. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Harris. Dr. Harris, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ariana. And thank you all for tuning in into this important conversation that we're going to have today. I will say that I am very much honored and humbled to be asked to lead this conversation at such an important time, a critical time in our country's history. Before I begin, I want to thank and acknowledge President Clave for providing the space and the platform for us to have this conversation. I think we can all agree that this is a conversation that's not happening everywhere. And so I do appreciate the leadership of the institution for allowing us to have this. I want to thank and acknowledge Dr. Ana Gonzalez, a colleague who I've known since 1996. I think when I met Anna, she was director of the Cross-Cultural Center at UC Irvine, and I was an undergraduate at Loyola Marymount University. And so by my count, I've known Anna for 24 years. So it's an honor and a privilege to be in this space with her and to be speaking at an institution that she leads. And of course, major shout out to Dr. Jennifer Alanis and Dr. Ariana Figueroa for their work behind the scenes and coordinating and handling the logistics and making sure that everyone and that I had what I needed in order to fully participate. And I know our sponsoring organizations have already been acknowledged, but I think it's important to do so again. So thank you, Black Lives at MUD, the Office of Black Student Affairs, and Chicano Latinx Student Affairs. Thank you for your sponsorship and support. And then lastly, before we get into the content, I want to acknowledge that today's event just happens to coincide with the day that the officers who killed Breonna Taylor were absolved of her murder. And so this is, of course, a devastatingly painful decision to accept, but it also underscores the importance of conversations like the one that we're going to have today. And perhaps more importantly, the need to continue to fight for racial justice. And it is my hope that today is just the beginning of a conversation around racial equity and racial justice, and that it will provide the motivation, the language, and the platform for everyone at Harvey Mudd to continue to be further engaged in the conversation. The objectives for today are fairly straightforward. There are three in particular. So I'm going to spend some time unpacking issues related to racism and racial equity and how they impact, first and foremost, the experiences of Black and Indigenous people in the United States, and more specifically, students of color in higher education. I'm also going to talk about some institutional barriers that make it difficult for us to achieve racial equity and to become anti-racist institutions. And then finally, I'm going to propose some strategies to achieve what I call institutional transformation for racial equity. And quick disclaimer, I will say that I probably have prepared more content than I actually have time to fully deliver today. And so, there may be some parts of this address where I might move a little bit fast, but I also want to make sure that we have enough time for Q&A and dialogue at the end. So, please forgive me in advance for that. As Jennifer mentioned, in addition to my role as a professor of post-secondary education at San Diego State University, I also co-direct a research center called the Community College Equity Assessment Lab. It's a center that I founded with a good friend and a colleague, Dr. J. Luke Wood, who some of you may know. And essentially the work that we do at SIL is working primarily with community colleges, not exclusively, but primarily with institutions who desire to institutionalize equity. And so the work at SIL has focused on assessment, it's focused on empirical research, and it is focused on professional learning. So a lot of the insights that I'll share today are derived from my work with hundreds of institutions over the last several years and doing really challenging work to disrupt inequity, to reveal and dismantle systems of oppression within institutions. And a lot of what I'll have to share is going to be informed by my work in that space and in that context. I'm also going to use the word equity quite a bit during our time together. So I think it's important that we have a shared understanding and a shared concept of what it is. Equity is essentially, at its core, I should say, equity is about enacting intentional strategies to address disparities that impact students who experience what we call disproportionate impact, meaning that we know that there are certain groups of students who don't fully benefit from their participation in post-secondary education as much as other students. And we also know from our work that there are certain groups that consistently experience disproportionate impact in education. This is by no means an exhaustive list. And I also want to acknowledge that there's a lot of intersectionality that exists amongst the populations that are represented here as well. And then, of course, you cannot have a conversation about equity without intentionally engaging the concept of equity mindedness. And for those who may not be familiar with this concept, it was given to us by Dr. Estella Ben-Simone well over 2 decades ago. And essentially, she talks about equity mindedness as the ways in which we bring equity to life as educators, as students. It's comprised primarily of 5 characteristics, being systemically aware, looking at issues related to equity from an institutional responsibility perspective, meaning that we're not asking what's wrong with students, but as educators, we assume personal accountability and responsibility for disrupting inequity, affirming students in their racialized identities, not seeing race as a liability, but seeing it as an asset. And I know that historically that hasn't been the case in higher education, and we're going to kind of unpack and talk about some implications of that. And also, being critically reflective about who we are in this space, how do we can either contribute to racial inequity, or how do we disrupt and dismantle it? And then, just authentic care, meaning that we have to have a vested interest in students' lives and in their success. My focus today is also going to be very much prioritize racial equity. We have to acknowledge that being race conscious is at the core of equity mindedness. And so this is not to say that other forms of oppression and discrimination are not important and should not be acknowledged, but it does remind us that race cannot be substituted or overlooked in our efforts to achieve educational equity. And I think we can all agree when we think about, the events that have really impacted our country, most recently over the past 6 or 7 months, although, we can argue that a lot of what we see today, are really the outcomes of more than 400 years of systemic oppression. But when we look at what's been happening more recently, then, hopefully that gives us an understanding of why we have to be intentionally focused on racial equity. So given that, I also want to acknowledge that I know for a lot of us and, for a lot of folks are entering this conversation on racial equity and anti-racism, that it was the murder of George Floyd that really motivated this larger national conversation and broader engagement and participation in this conversation around, racism, and even more specifically, anti-Black racism. And so, while I think that's important, what we also have to recognize is that the lives of Black people, the lives of people of color and communities of color have never really been fully valued in our country. And so, what we see here is a snapshot of many of the racialized atrocities that have been enacted systematically to destroy the lives and communities of people of color. And so, while again, this fight for racial justice in many ways is motivated by the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and Tony McDade and Sean Reed and far too many others, we also have to recognize that this has been, we've been at this for centuries. And obviously there's an urgent need to continue to do so. We also have to think critically about, what are the lived experiences like for Black and Indigenous people in the United States. These are just, again, a handful of examples of that shows the effects of systemic oppression and systemic racism. We know that we often reside in communities with poor environmental conditions, so air quality, being one of them. Also, communities with few health promoting amenities. So you think about things like parks and lakes and things like that. I think the Flint water crisis is an example of how, again, the Black and Indigenous people of color are heavily concentrated in communities with chronic environmental hazards and fewer resources that promote good health, like parks, like recreation centers, and like health food markets, health food stores. We also know that, for example, Blacks and Latinos comprise about 29% of the population in the United States, but account for 57% of those who are incarcerated. So the effects of mass incarceration are real and transparent. With regard to education, in 2016, about 30% of Blacks between the ages of 25 and 34 held bachelor's degrees. Comparatively, about 50% of whites in this age bracket held bachelor's degrees. In 2018, the poverty rate for Blacks and Native Americans were 22% and 24% respectively, so almost a quarter of those populations compared to 9% for whites. And then we also know that Black families are less likely to be homeowners than white families. And there are other, a multitude of health disparities that also plague people of color as well that, we don't have the time to necessarily discuss in detail. But these are things that we have to acknowledge and be mindful of. And then when we talk about how does this play out specifically within the context of higher education, that when it comes to people of color, that there is a lack of representation amongst students, especially at colleges like Harvey Mudd, like selective institutions, as well as the faculty. Deficit perspectives are alive and well. We'll talk about what those are and what they look like shortly. There's often a disconnect in the curriculum. So both the lives of people of color and the contributions of people of color are typically not acknowledged and not visible in the curriculum that many of our institutions are using to educate students. And then there's the persistent microaggressions and racially hostile climates that are also salient it. To talk about this latter point, I want to spend a little bit of time on it. I want to highlight this concept that my colleague Luke and I came up with. We call it the 3D effect. And essentially, the 3D effect identifies the three most prevailing stereotypes of people of color in education. And so the first D is described as distrust. And this relates to the assumption that people of color, and in particular men of color, are associated with being thugs, deviants, and criminals. The second D, disregard, relates to an ascription of intelligence. And here we assume that people of color, in particular students of color, are not only unprepared for college, but also intellectually inferior to white students. And then finally, we have disdain, which assumes that people of color come from families and communities that don't value education. The key point here is that these stereotypes are often unconsciously held by educators, but they have a profound influence on the ways in which they teach and they serve students of color. To give a little bit more detail, about these three stereotypes and microaggressions, just to provide a few examples here, where we talk about assumption of criminality. These are a few statements that I've heard over the years in my work with colleges. Some of these may sound familiar to those of us who are attending. Some may be a surprise. I'm not going to read them all to y'all, but one that I would like to highlight that I think tends to be salient now is the second one on the list. Where a colleague will say, well, I have to be honest. I have this inherent fear of Black and Latino men, right? And it's not that I'm trying to be racist. It's just this gut reaction that I have that tells me that I need to protect myself. But I think, oftentimes we don't engage in a deep examination or consideration of what motivates and what stimulates that gut reaction, right? Oftentimes, again, it's things like implicit and unconscious bias that is derived from a multitude of sources and so forth that programs us and tells us that we need to fear and be mindful and conscious about, when we're in the presence of Black and Latino men. Ascription of intelligence, again, is when we assign a degree of intelligence to a person of color based on race. Some things that we often hear in our work from students about, if a student who for whom English may be their second language, maybe there's a noticeable accent when they speak, are often tell us that they're the last to be picked for group projects, or there's this assumption from classmates that they're not as smart and that they're not as intelligent or not as capable of being successful or making a valuable intellectual contribution in this space. And then the last one, again, pathologizing culture. And this is where we, again, assume that people of color, students of color in particular, come from families and communities that don't value education. Some things that we often hear, those students, right? And the subtext here is those students of color don't care about education, right? They're here for some reason other than to learn and to be successful and to obtain a degree or credential, or whatever it may be. And there's always, some assumption of suspicion or, the assumption that these students are not here for reasons other than education. And then also, the sort of bringing all of this conversation around racial microaggressions, kind of bringing it together. I want to highlight this framework called racial battle fatigue. It comes from a professor, William Smith, who's a professor at the University of Utah. And I find this framework to be incredibly enlightening in helping us recognize the cumulative effects of chronic racism on campus. And while most scholars have focused primarily on racial microaggressions, which, again, I think is important to do, what I appreciate about this framework is that it extends the conversation by arguing that racism is not just something that happens ever so often for people of color, but rather it's a phenomenon that affects nearly every aspect of our lived experiences in the academy being institutions of higher education. And because the effects of racism are enduring and they actually become a core part of our life history. So for example, you'd be hard pressed to ask a Black person to describe what is it like to be Black without them somehow talking about how racism has had some impact on their identity and their lived experiences. And what I also appreciate here is that Smith makes a connection between racial battle fatigue and a phenomenon known as combat stress syndrome. And combat stress syndrome is essentially what soldiers who are in combat zones experience as a result of being immersed in high-risk environments where the threat of being attacked is ever present. And so what Smith says is that, people of color in the academy often experience a range of physiological symptoms as a result of racial battle fatigue. Maybe you see them here presented on the screen, as well as psychological consequences or psychological symptoms, again, that can be directly attributed to their experiences with chronic racism. And unfortunately, I think what we're learning and what we find is that these symptoms are often misdiagnosed or erroneously attributed to factors other than racialized stress. I think I'd also say that when we talk to our colleagues who have some training in mental health, so social work, marriage and family therapy, and related fields, many say that there's no training or no real instruction or no guidance on how to recognize racial battle fatigue and actually, support clients in sort of working through it and overcoming it. And so, again, this is just important background and important context to understand why we have to not just make sure that our institutions are not racist, but that we are actively working towards being anti-racist institutions, because the life implications are profound for people of color. I think this is, this may be a good time for us for me to pause and check in, ask, are there any questions or thoughts or reactions to anything that I've shared thus far? And if so, I would just encourage you to, well, now that I think about this, I think we're in a webinar format, so we can't unmute ourselves. So maybe given that, we'll go ahead and hold questions until the end is what we'll do. Sort of taking this conversation further around racial equity and institutionalizing racial equity, I also want to share a framework that, another framework that Luke and I developed a few years ago. And we developed this framework to kind of help us make sense of the range of perspectives that we were encountering on a regular basis in our work with colleges. And so we found that, we're visiting colleges and we're literally engaging hundreds of colleagues on a regular basis. And there was a wide range of perspectives on what equity is, what racial equity is, how important is it, how do we achieve it, how do we institutionalize it. And so we felt like we needed to have a framework to help us make sense of it. We needed to have a framework to have productive dialogue and conversations with our colleagues. And we also felt like we needed to leave folks, with a tool or something that they can use after we've, our engagement with the college, had concluded. And so the taxonomy, as you'll see, it has two constructs. The first is competence, and it's represented at the very top with the labels, know what to do and don't know what to do. And we can simply think about competence as related to an educator's knowledge and understanding of racial equity and equity mindedness, and having some capacity and expertise in being able to engage practices that have been known to disrupt inequity, right? So if we're talking about a faculty member, someone who is, understands the importance of culturally relevant pedagogy and is able to incorporate tools and incorporate strategies to make their courses culturally relevant into their courses, right? Or if we're talking about a colleague who works in student affairs or in another student services capacity, they understand the importance of intrusive practices and how intrusive practices really, again, help to disrupt patterns of inequity for students of color. And they not only understand it, but they actually incorporate those practices on a regular basis. So that's our first construct, competence. The second construct is motivation, because what we also know is that it's not enough to just know what equity is and to know what equity mindedness is. You also have to have a motivation and a willingness to practice it and incorporate equity-minded practices into your work with students. And so this second construct is represented at the left of the figure with, and is labeled willingness to employ practices or unwillingness to employ practices. So if we start with the box at the top right that's labeled KW, this captures this perspective of educators who know what racial equity is, who understand equity mindedness, and they practice it on a regular basis. And perhaps predictably, we call this group the choir. And we call this group the choir because more often than not, it's the choir who's leading equity efforts and conversations on their campuses, right? So these are the ones, they know what it is, they're highly motivated to do it, and they're doing it on a regular basis. Now, the next group we have are the allies. And the allies are situated at the top left. And the only thing that separates the allies from the choir is that the allies haven't had the coaching, they haven't had the professional development, they haven't had the opportunity to build their capacity to be, build their capacity to infuse racial equity and equity-minded practices into their work. However, if you give them the opportunity to learn it, they could just as easily become a part of the choir. Now, the next group we have, they're at the bottom left, they are called the resistors. And the resistors, sort of to state it simply, the resistors have not embraced equity-mindedness. They don't see it as necessary. And quite frankly, they're not motivated to do it. And so we find in our work that there are two types of resistors, active resistors and passive resistors, right? Of course, active resistors are the ones who are most vocal and most forthcoming about their opposition to equity efforts. So why are we doing this? You know, racism doesn't exist. This isn't important. You know, who's this Frank Harris guy? Why is he coming to talk to us? He's a fraud, etc. Right? Now, the good news, perhaps, is that most resistors are not active resistors. We tend to think that they represent a larger contingent than they actually do because, again, they're very vocal, they're very transparent. But we find that most resistors are actually passive resistors. And what that means is that they're not going to be as vocal and as transparent about their opposition, but they're also going to avoid any and every opportunity that they have to be authentically engaged in it. And there's certainly no motivation for them to disrupt inequity in the spaces in which they have some authority and responsibility. And then we have the defiant. And these are the folks who have been trained. They have a good understanding of equity and equity-mindedness. However, they refuse to enact the practices with the students who need the support, at least, you know, the ones who need the support the most, right? So maybe they're willing to be intrusive with, you know, a student who they know, a student who works in their research lab, but they're not necessarily willing to do it with the students who need the support the most, students who are disproportionately impacted on their campuses. Now, one time Luke and I was presenting this framework at a conference or a meeting, I can't remember what it was, and we got some feedback from a colleague who said, you know, I think the framework is good. It makes a lot of sense. It's aligned with my perspective and aligned with my understanding and some of the things that I experienced, but it's missing something. What about the folks who think they're equity-minded, who think they're a part of the choir, but they have no idea what they're doing? And so Luke and I, we reflected on that a little bit, reflected on that question, and we decided to add a fifth group to our taxonomy, and we call this group the oblivious. And we call this group the oblivious because we find that one can arrive at being oblivious in one of three ways. The first is when we approach equity work from a savior complex, when we believe that our work is about saving students rather than empowering them. The second is when we are not reflective in our work with students, meaning that it's when this occurs when the words and the values that we espouse are not aligned with our actions and the ways in which we teach and serve students. And then finally, we have grandstanding. And this is when our commitment to equity is not really about equity. It's really more about developing a reputation for it, or about advancing our careers, or being perceived a certain way by colleagues, but we don't really authentically care about equity and the students who are most adversely impacted by inequity. And so I share that to say is that as we continue to have conversations, right, long after this engagement has concluded, and we want to get more friends and more colleagues, and we have to find ways to get others involved in this conversation. What we have to do and what we have to recognize is that we have to be targeted in our messaging, right? We can't approach every person in the same way, right? So we talk about the 4 E's. So with the choir, we have to empower the choir, right? The choir needs to know that racial equity is important. It's good for students. It's good for our institution. You know, continue to do it, right? What you're doing is important. Go forth. With our allies, we gotta build their capacity, right? They have some education that needs to happen. Remember, they're already motivated, right? And perhaps they're motivated because they're motivated by racial equity because they're already involved in another, you know, supporting other communities who are systemically oppressed or disproportionately impacted. But we may need to help them build their capacity to be more engaged and be more effective as it relates to racial equity. And then with our passive resistors and the defiant, we have to encourage them to care. We have to encourage them and help them see the connection between their efforts to disrupt inequity and why it's good for them. And again, why is it good for the institution? And then with our oblivious colleagues and friends, we have to enlighten them. And it's not just about enlightening them, it's about helping them understand. I would say, here's what I say: we have to have critical but collegial conversations with them and helping them understand, like, okay, Frank, what you said, I really appreciate you. I really appreciate your interest. But when you say that, we can't hire qualified minority candidates. We don't have diversity on campus amongst our faculty and staff because there aren't enough qualified candidates. Then, that's really not aligned with what I understand equity and equity mindedness to be. And it certainly doesn't help us move forward or move any closer to our goals to disrupt inequity, right? And so we just have to be mindful about where we are in this space, and then how are we engaging the folks, and where are the folks that we're engaging, where are they in this. And so given all that, what I want to do is make sure that we talk about anti-racism and how all of this fits into and should inform our efforts to, again, achieve in becoming an anti-racist institution, right? I call this a call to anti-racist action. And before we begin, I want to make sure that we have a shared understanding of racism and what is racism and how does it operate. In doing so, I'm going to borrow from the work of Dr. Ibram Kendi, who I would imagine that most of us who are here know, the brilliant scholar who wrote the book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. And what Kendi tells us is that racist policies are ultimately what produces racial inequity. And so now we often think about policies in a very formal way, right, such as laws and executive orders and so forth. But for the purposes of our discussion today, I want us to think about both formal and informal policies, right? Think about policies in both the formal and an informal way, right? And so an informal policy may be something, it's not necessarily written anywhere, but it's widely practiced and it has a profound impact on people's life, right? So think about it in that way. So we have racist policies and we justify racist policies by racist ideas, right? And racist ideas, again, are, according to Kendi, are the attitudes, the beliefs, and the assumptions that a racial group is superior or inferior to another group. This is what's used to justify racist policies. And I'm gonna actually offer a few examples of each of these in just a few minutes, so bear with me. But when we combine racist policies and racist ideas, then this is what gives us racial inequity, right? And it's not just that we have racial inequity. That in and of itself, of course, is not good. But even worse is that racial inequity is normalized to the point, racial inequity is so ingrained in our culture, right? And it's become so normalized and so acceptable that we often feel like we don't even need to do anything about it, right? And let me offer a couple examples, actually 3 examples of each of these and how they work, right? So let's think about some racist policies that have, long been present in the United States, right? These are 3, right? School segregation, redlining, and mass incarceration, right? Policies that have been around for a long time. And when we think about the racist ideas that are used to justify those racist policies, right? So, for example, school segregation, the underlying idea is that, Black and indigenous people of color are intellectually inferior to whites. And so they certainly don't deserve schools of equal quality and certainly should not be educated in the same spaces as whites, right? That's what gives us school segregation. Now, I know some of you are probably thinking, hey, Frank, newsflash, we don't have school segregation anymore, right? That went away with Brown v. Board, Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954, I believe it was. And so to that, I would say, yeah, we don't have school segregation that's actually written, that's sort of, as a legal doctrine. But when we look at our schools, when we look at, both the racial composition of most public schools in our country, as well as the ways in which they're resourced, we essentially have de facto school segregation. There have been some recent studies that have said that schools today are actually more racially segregated than they were in the 1950s and in the 1960s and so forth. But anyway, so school segregation is our racist policy. The racist idea, Blacks, indigenous people of color, intellectually inferior to whites, can't be educated in the same spaces. Let's talk about redlining. And redlining is rooted in the idea that Black and indigenous people of color are not financially responsible, and therefore an investment in them and in their communities comes with significant financial risk for lenders. And then we have mass incarceration, which we talked about a little bit already, but that stems from the racist idea that Black and indigenous people of color are more prone to violence and crime, and so you have to police them more harshly. You have to have harsher sentencing laws, and all of this, right? Sort of the result that we get racial inequity across the board here, right? So with school segregation, we see the attainment gap, the educational attainment gap. With redlining, we get the wealth gap, right? Particularly when we talk about wealth that's derived from owning property and owning real estate. And then with mass incarceration, we have, what we call the justice gap. And so all of this is important to understand as we reflect and think about and ask the question, well, what do we need to do to decolonize our institutions, right? Recognizing that, education in the United States was never designed for the participation of people of color, of women, people from a lower socioeconomic status, people with disabilities, and so forth. And so, in many ways, what we're trying to do is reform and rescue a system that was never really designed at all to educate the folks who are seeking education and who deserve to be educated. And so what I'm going to do is offer, I think I have about 8 or so strategies that I think are important to do. And I'm going to move through those. And hopefully that'll give us enough time, maybe about 10 or 15 minutes for us to engage in, to answer questions and to, have a little bit of a dialogue. But first is we have to do this, right? We have to recognize that institutions that are authentically committed to becoming an anti-racist institution, they have to have what I call a transparent reconciliation of the ways in which racism and white supremacy sits at the core of its history and legacy. So for example, the institution needs to learn, this is an example, how are Black and indigenous bodies used as labor and capital to build and fund the institution? It also entails identifying racist institutional policies and practices that both denied access to the institution for Black and indigenous people of color, but also sanction the racialized trauma that have been experienced by these communities, since the institution's origins. And so, some may find it valuable to convene a task force to do this effort. If so, it needs to be comprised of a broad group of stakeholders. So, faculty, staff, students, community members, and then having somebody who has some expertise in history or archival research would be very helpful in this effort. And so, and also I think it's important, and this is a point that can't be lost here, is that you have to share the findings of the effort in a town hall meeting or in a report that's publicly available on the institution's website. So I see a lot of institutions that go through all sorts of efforts to identify inequity and to disrupt racism. And when they're not satisfied with the findings, then they sort of bury it. And so that, in my opinion, that's a huge mistake and a huge missed opportunity to engage in some reconciliation. The last point I'll say about this first step is that you also have to make sure you find tangible ways to atone for the history and the legacy of racism at the institution. So you might consider creating a scholarship for students of color. You might name an important campus building or campus program after, a prominent alum of color. You might decide to waive tuition and fees for students of color for a period of time. You might establish an endowed professorship for faculty who are committed to conducting research that improves the lives and conditions of students of color. Whatever it is, you have to do something. There has to be, some steps for reconciliation. It's not enough to just say, oh, wow, these things happened in our past. They were horrible. We want to make sure they don't happen again. But you have to do something to atone for what's occurred. Okay, I'm gonna try to move a little bit faster here with these. The second one is that we have to lift minoritized voices, provide space and opportunity to really understand the lived experiences of both students and faculty and staff, folks who work at the institution, to really understand what is it like to be a person of color in this space, right? And what are some ways in which racism has impacted your success as a student, as an employee, whatever it may be, right? Whatever your role may be. Two things here that I would add is that make sure that there's some intentionality around intersectionality. So if you're going to be looking to students, don't just get your student leaders and the students who are convenient and easy to access. Think about all your other students who may not be well represented in leadership positions. Think about the intersectionality of other salient identities, many of which you see represented here. And then again, believe what folks tell you and make the findings public. That's important to do. Thirdly, we have to think about how is campus racism embedded in our campus culture. We need to look at the context of teaching and learning, and particularly the curriculum. We need to look at student services. I would say for student services, what we find is that, in many ways, students of color are underserved, underchallenged, and unwelcome, right? Those are things that we have to pay close attention to. And then within the context of human resources, how hiring happens, everything from the position description to committees, to campus visits, as well as performance evaluations and grievances. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done there. We need to critically examine student conduct data, also as an important first step. Looking at ways are minoritized students overrepresented among students who are referred to campus for campus policy violations? If so, where are those referrals originating from? Are sanctions being equity applied and so forth? We need to look at racism in campus policing. This is, a real, the institution of policing is one that's become a real salient part of the conversation around anti-racism. So look at, again, how are campus police engaging students? Are there some opportunities to engage in some assessment and evaluation of the cultural proficiency of officers? Are there some opportunities for further training and professional learning for officers? Are there some ways in which officers can engage communities, and in particular communities of color, and sort of, the way I like to describe it, when they're not on duty and not in uniform, right, as a way to sort of build and bridge relationships between populations. We also have to engage in what I call a comprehensive strategy for addressing racism. What I'll say about this is that if becoming an anti-racist institution is important, it should be reflected in the mission statement. It should be reflected in the value statement. It should be reflected in the strategic plan. There should be some measurable goals that that sort of help move the institution towards anti-racism, as well as some resources that are allocated towards achieving those goals. We also have to disaggregate student success data in order to reveal hidden patterns of racial inequity. One of the most persistent and transparent indicators of racism is when students of color don't do as well as white students at the institution. And so there's work to be done here. These are some potential data points for disaggregation and examination that can be a part of this conversation. The other thing I would say here is that not just looking at these data at an institutional level, but looking at them at a college level, departmental level, and even the program level, if that's possible. And then the last point here is that we have to build a culture of a commitment to anti-racism. right? So that means that there has to be ample professional learning opportunities for everyone at the college. My colleague Luke, who I've referenced, mentioned a couple times already, designed this free public course called Black Minds Matter. That's a wonderful course with amazing speakers. It has a curriculum, there's readings. And so the link to it is here. You could also just go to YouTube and Google Black Minds Matter. And, all of the entire course has been recorded and archived. And it's a free, great resource for building capacity around anti-racism. And then, of course, there's some, list of must-reads, in my opinion, for anyone who's really looking to build their capacity to be anti-racist educators. With that, that brings us to the end of the content that I prepared. And this leaves us a good 15 minutes or so for Q&A and dialogue. And thank you again so much for your involvement in this important conversation. And I'm going to defer to Jenny to guide us in the Q&A portion here.
Thank you, Dr. Harris, for that wonderful presentation. The first question that we have in the Q&A box is, can you discuss how public K-12 education that was brought forth in the Williams case addresses inequalities in California's higher education system?
Yeah, the K-12 space is really not my area of expertise, and so I'm not familiar with the Williams case, right? So, I probably shouldn't be speaking on a case that I'm not familiar with. That being said, I know public K-12 education is wrought with inequities. In large part because of the ways in which public K-12 education is funded. Largely funded by property taxes. And so what you have is that wealthy communities have wealthy schools that continue to get more resources than schools that are in communities that are not as well resourced, right? Or not as wealthy, at least from a tax-based perspective. And so I think there has to be some intentional disruption around, figuring out how do we fund public schools. We have to do it more equitably. We also have a lot of work to do around building the capacity of our K-12 educators, both from a pedagogical perspective, but also from a perspective, as it relates to being able to build relationships with students of color and being able to build relationships and engage the communities in which these schools are situated, right? So there's a lot of work to do there. Not my area of expertise, so I'm sorry I can't speak specifically, about the Williams case. But I know that there's a lot of work that needs to be done in that space as well.
Our next question is, how do you foresee job descriptions being made more inclusive? Or what are some tangible proposals for making institutions more inclusive with their policies or their job searches?
Yeah, so we already see some progress in this area. So we see institutions that are more transparent in their job descriptions about saying, we're looking for an equity-minded educator who has expertise in working with students who've been historically marginalized in education, right? And so I think it's important to just transparently spell out what you're looking for. Now, obviously, you can't say, hey, we want a faculty person of color or, so forth, a staff person. But when you spell out the competencies that you're looking for, particularly the competencies that are directly related to racial equity or that contribute to racial equity, then that's going to really help attract a pool of candidates who are authentically engaged in that work and in that space. Now, it can't just stop with the position description. So when you bring a candidate to campus, for example, you need to have them provide tangible evidence, not of what they would do, but things that they've already done, right, in order to demonstrate their capacity to be an equity-minded educator. So if we're talking about a faculty member, right, give us a teaching demonstration that you would do for students who have been historically marginalized in the context of math, right? If we're talking about someone working as a student affairs advisor, design a program, design an initiative, show us what you've done to disrupt racial inequity at your institution. We also have to think about How do we engage colleagues during campus visits, right? Because sometimes during campus visits, um, there can be some unintentional things that happen that can turn candidates off, right? So, for example, I think one salient example here also is we have to stop evaluating people based on their quote unquote fit, right? Is Frank a good? We like Frank because he would fit well with what we have and what we're doing here, right? And fit is just really, in many ways, code for maintaining the status quo, right? And we got to stop evaluating people based on their hair or their clothes that they wear, right? So there's a lot that we can do, to disrupt in many ways white supremacy and hiring processes, because that's essentially what we have. And that's why we see a lot of the inequities that we see with regard to faculty and staff representation.
Our next question states, BIPOC are underrepresented on the faculty, but overrepresented on the staff. How do you bring staff voices into this conversation when they do not have much of a voice in the governance of a college or university? Would you agree that giving voice to staff is a step toward anti-racism?
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. I think whenever we expand voice and representation, right, that helps gets us closer to becoming anti-racist. Now, that can't be all that we do, right? You can't just stop there. And I know institutional governance structures, especially in higher education, are complex and cumbersome and bureaucratic, right? And in many ways, they can be a barrier to doing a lot of the things that we know that needs to be done. But I think as a starting point is making sure that we intentionally seeking the voices of our faculty, of our staff of color, right? And getting a sense of first of all, what are their lived experiences and how is racism impacting their work, impacting their progression, their professional progression, right? As a starting point. And then also looking to them as assets and looking to them as resources. Because what they often say is those who are closest to the problem often have the best solutions, but are usually the furthest away from power and influence and resources to make it happen, right? And so I think part of what we have to do is a better job of seeking the voices of our black and indigenous people of color among staff, among students as well, because they often have the best solutions to a lot of the problems that we're trying to solve around anti-racism.
Are there any colleges or universities doing a good job or making good progress towards being anti-racist?
I see some institutions having some success in some areas, right? So you might have some institutions that are doing a good job with dismantling and looking at the curriculum, or other institutions that might be doing a good job with regard to hiring. I will say this, I've gotten the opportunity to sort of travel across the country and engage a lot of institutions in this work. And the institutions that I think have the most transparent and progressive practices around this are California community colleges. Now, again, there are huge disparities. There are huge equity issues in California community colleges. So by no means am I saying, they're the blueprint or the standard for what we need to do. But the California community colleges they all have to write student equity plans every year. And those student equity plans have to have data that are disaggregated by race and ethnicity, and in some cases even further. They have to propose activities in order to close the equity gaps that we see. They have to have measurable goals. The state allocates funding directly to institutions to do the things that are proposed in the equity plans. They do what I think are some transparent practices around hiring. And, and again, if I were to, I always like to be, I don't always like to name institutions, right? I like to be careful about that. But I would take a look at San Diego Mesa College and what Pam Luster is doing there, around institutional transformation and building capacity there as a starting point. And again, it's not to say that things are perfect there, but they're doing some things that I think are a little more progressive than what we typically see.
We have two final questions. The first one is, how is work inside of institutions mirrored and supported by presidents of the colleges?
Sorry.
How is work inside of institutions mirrored and supported by presidents of the colleges? So what I'm thinking for this question is, how is the work that we're seeing happening in institutions, is it getting to the presidential level, and are they truly supporting it? Or how can presidents engage more with the equity work that's happening at the ground level?
There's a wide range here, to be honest. We know that we see measurable success when it's prioritized at the highest level, and not even just at the presidential level, but at the board of trustee level as well. And so that's where we can see real progress, right? Because the president, the leadership, sets the tone and sets the agenda and has a huge impact on the culture of an institution as it relates to equity efforts. I've seen it other places where the leadership is not supportive, and I'm not saying that it can't happen there, but it's a much longer and tougher road when you have that.
Thank you. And our final question for the evening: one challenge in retaining faculty of color is using course evaluations to measure teaching ability, because course evaluations can be biased. Have you seen an alternative to course evaluations that can help to mitigate bias in evaluating teaching?
So first of all, I agree. The research tells us that faculty of color, and in particular women of color, right, that they really are disadvantaged by the inherent bias that we often see with course evaluations. And so I can't say that there are good alternatives, but I think the institutions that aren't just looking at course evaluations to evaluate teaching, so they're doing a good job of looking at peer evaluations, and they're getting other data points and treating those data points as just as important as the course evaluation data. That's where we see some potential for promise. By and large, most institutions are not there and have a ways to go. But yeah, there needs to be more. I don't want to say creative practice. We need more equity-minded practices as it relates to course evaluations, for sure.
Thank you so much for all the questions we couldn't get to. We'll send to Dr. Harris, and maybe he can send us his thoughts on the question and we can get it out to participants. We want to thank you for being here with us tonight in the first session of our Anti-Racist series. Thank you to my colleagues in CLSA and OBSA and the ASHMIC diversity directors, and to our student organization BLAM for co-sponsoring not only this talk but this series. And thank you, Dr. Harris, for being here with us tonight.
Thank you for having me again. Thank you for allowing me to kick off this important series. If I can be a resource in any way, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. Thank you so much.